Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin by just lightening the mood a little. My colleague referred to Mr. Burns and the anti-abortion protest he was arrested for, and I defended him. And we were in court on Monday, and it was a long fight. And we didn't get to trial. We made an application that the charge has no merit and should be withdrawn. And the police turned up and they said, look, we agree. And the charge was withdrawn. And Mr. Burns looked at the judge. He said, Your Honour, he said, I want you to know that Jesus loves you. Compared to what some of my clients have said to judges, it was a distinct improvement. The Free Speech Union is a multinational organisation. It began in Britain. We were the second. There are now free speech unions in the various stages of development in Australia, South Africa, Switzerland and Canada. I have the privilege of chairing it in New Zealand. The man you're about to hear from is my counterpart in the United Kingdom. Nigel Biggar, CBE, is a British Anglican priest, theologian and ethicist, a former professor of moral and pastoral theology at the University of Oxford, and the man who set up a special research group in the University of Oxford to look at the issue of ethics and empire. A serious academic analysis of what empires have been in the history of the human race. And as you appreciate, this is a somewhat contentious topic because you're only allowed one opinion on empire. He has written a book. The book is for sale here today, and if you buy one, he will sign it. And the book is called Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. His speech today touches on the same themes, and his speech today is called Colonialism and Free Speech. And you might wonder, why do those things go together? Those things go together because an analysis of colonialism is now, in the modern world, something that has to be defended. There's a lot of people who would have you believe that there is no need to analyse colonialism. The question is settled. It was all bad. There's nothing to see here. Move on. And what we stand for is the right to say, that may not be true. Here's the evidence. To hear from the man himself, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Biggar.
Thank you, Roderick, very much for the warm welcome. Thank you enormously, Jonathan and the FSU, for bringing me to New Zealand for my first time. It's been a flying visit, but I've seen enough to know I want to come back. So let me take you back to December 2017. There I am with my American wife, Ginny, in the British Airways lounge in Heathrow Airport. We're about to board a plane to celebrate our wedding anniversary in Germany. Being an obsessive emailer, you'll understand I just have to check my inbox one last time in case something earth-shattering has arrived to change my life. Well, it did kind of. So I checked my inbox and there's an email from something I'd never heard of before called the Public Affairs Directorate of Oxford University, my university. And this message, when I clicked on it, tells me that my Ethics and Empire project that Roderick just mentioned had become the object of an online protest from a group of students in Oxford. But the university said, don't worry, we have your back. You're a grown-up. You can do whatever daft research you want to do. I thought nothing of it. We flew to, as it happens, Nuremberg. I only tell that to friends. My wife likes Christmas markets. I like history. That was on a Thursday when we flew. On a Saturday, my main historian collaborator because actually the project Ethics in Empire was designed mainly by him, not by me. He emailed me to say that he was alarmed at the protest, and he was resigning from the project. That was on a Saturday. On the Tuesday, a second online protest signed by 58 Oxford colleagues was published, and then on the Thursday, a third one signed by 190 academics worldwide, addressed to Oxford University, urging the university to cut its support for my project. For over a fortnight, my name was in the press every day. So what had I done to deserve all this uninvited attention? A couple of things. First of all, in late November, I had published an article in the London Times making what I thought to be the completely incontrovertible argument that we British, you New Zealanders, we can look at our colonial history and we can find things in there that give us cause for pride and shame and pride, lament and admiration. I didn't say which weighed more heavily, I just said we can find both. Who could possibly disagree with that? And a few days later, I finally got round to publishing an online account of the Ethics in Empire project, which, as Roderick said, it's not concerned to defend the British Empire. It was concerned to look at how did ancient Chinese people view their empires of the time? How did medieval Arabs view their empires? We tend to regard empires as bad things. Did they think the same? The answer, in case you were wondering, is they didn't think about empire at all. It was a fact of life. Anyway, the posting of this description of the Ethics in Empire project was quite enough to arouse the ire of the academic forces of repression, because, as I later found out, on the 13th of December 2017 at 8:45 a.m., I know this because I have a screenshot of the tweet, Dr. Priyambada Gopal, reader in post-colonial studies at the University of Cambridge. Cambridge doesn't come off well in this. She tweeted to her allies in Oxford in response to the online description of my project, OMG, oh my God, this is serious shit. We need to, block capitals, shut this down. Now, the effect of all this online mobbing was unnerving and damaging. In those days, I was a mild-mannered, thin-skinned, delicate academic. I told you my historian colleague jumped ship within 4 days. One of my oldest friends urged me to abandon the project, telling me that the topic was toxic. And when I didn't abandon the project, he resigned from the advisory council of a research center I ran. I had to delay the project because if historians wouldn't play with us, the project was dead, because the project required ethicists and historians to collaborate. Now, happily, the project was saved. I found 4 fresh historians to join the project, 3 of whom did not have white skins. And since 2019, the 4 annual conferences we've held have attracted over 50 historians from Oxford and Cambridge, elsewhere in the UK, and from California to the Netherlands. So the Ethics in Empire project survived and completed its work last year. That attempt at cancellation failed. But a subsequent attempt did succeed for a while. One of the upsides of the row in December 17 was that I was offered a contract in March, April 18 to publish a book under the title An Intelligent Person's Guide to Colonialism. And this was offered by Bloomsbury Publishing, and I was contracted to produce a manuscript by the end of 2020. So, 31st of December, New Year's Eve, 3 p.m., 9 hours to spare, I press the send button, off goes the manuscript. 5th of January, my commissioning editor at Bloomsbury writes back and says, Nigel, I am speechless with admiration for your book's rigor and comprehensiveness. It's one of the most important books to come across my desk in years, and I predict sales of up to 15,000 copies. The manuscript goes into the copy editing process. They even design a cover. But on the 15th of March, I received an email from the top of Bloomsbury announcing that the company has decided to postpone publication indefinitely because, quote, public feeling is unfavorable. Being a man of a certain age and rather admiring Edwardian stoicism, I'm not entirely in touch with my emotions, but my touchy-feely American wife reports that I was devastated. She would know. But after I picked myself off my bed, I decided, although I'd been told that what had happened at Bloomsbury was that junior colleagues in the company had lobbied senior management and protested about having to work on such offensive material. I also been told that Bloomsbury wanted me to walk away from my contract, but I had no alternative. So I decided to engage them in some innocent exchange, and I said, so you're worried about public feeling? Do you know what? There's a lot of public feeling out there, and it doesn't all think the same thing. Which bit worries you? Strangely, they couldn't answer me. And then I said, okay, so you've said that conditions not currently favorable for publication, so when will they become favorable? Again, they couldn't answer me, they just returned the contract. So my book was cancelled. Happily, it was recovered. What Bloomsbury jettisoned, William Collins retrieved. It was published last year on the 2nd of February, and then another edition came out in March of this year. And it turns out that Robin Baird Smith was wrong. It did not sell 20,000 copies. It has so far sold over 60,000. So we have a problem, but there is hope. There is hope. Let me just talk very briefly about the kind of views I have of empire, so you have an understanding of why would I think it's so offensive. And see if you think I'm the right-wing extremist nutter that those on the left portray me as. Priyambagara Pal thinks I'm a bigot. My surname is unfortunate, it lends itself to that. In fact, it lends itself to worse than that. I'm a bigot, I'm a racist, I'm a white supremacist, and everything that comes out of my mouth is vomit, and I quote. Okay, so what's so offensive? My views are, first of all, folks, when we think about what British Empire did in New Zealand, let's put it in context. Empire was universal, practiced by people of every skin color on every continent, right? In the 1600s, the Iroquois did empire in North America. In the 1700s, the Comanche did empire in the southwest of what's now the US. In the 1820s, the Zulu did empire in South Africa. In 1835, the Maori invaded the Chatham Islands, slaughtered 10% of the population, and enslaved the rest. Everyone was doing empire. Is empire always illegitimate? The British Empire was not democratic until right near the end. Did that make it illegitimate? Well, about 10 years ago, I was visited in Oxford by a Chinese colleague from Hong Kong. And over dinner, I turned to Ping Chung and I said, okay, Ping Chung, tell me, what do you think of the British legacy in Hong Kong? And he said, well, if China had been a liberal democracy, non-democratic Hong Kong wouldn't have looked so good. But China wasn't a liberal democracy. And even though Hong Kong wasn't democratic, it had the rule of law, an independent judiciary, and an honest civil service. That's why, in the 1960s and late 50s and 60s, unnumbered millions of Chinese volunteered to flee mainland China into the British colony of Hong Kong to escape communism and anarchy and war on the Chinese mainland. And he said, my grandmother was one of them. And he said, she never learned to speak English, but she became a lifelong devotee of Princess Di. Empire is universal, it's not always illegitimate. Secondly, the phrase goes about at the moment that, which is widely used, colonialism and slavery. Colonialism and slavery, as if these two things were identical. Well, in the British Empire, they were identical for the first 150 years. In the second half, they were contrary. The British Empire was among the first states in the history of the world to abolish slavery within its territories, and then exploiting its dominant position after 1815, the empire spent the second half of its life suppressing slavery from Brazil across Africa, Middle East, India, Malaysia, New Zealand. So no, you can't talk of colonialism and slavery as if they were the same thing. Also, you can't say that the British Empire was essentially racist. Yes, there was lots of racial prejudice. And by the way, Europeans didn't invent prejudice, racial prejudice. If you look at the writings of a medieval Arab philosopher, I forget which one it was now, Ibn Khaldun perhaps, he's musing on why it is that Muslim Arabs are so superior to Europeans and Africans. He thinks it's the climate. It's too cold in Britain to be intelligent, and it's too hot in Africa not to be thick. Therefore, that's the reason why Arabs are naturally superior. Racial prejudice is an unfortunate human propensity. Britons didn't invent it. And by the way, yes, if there was racism in the British Empire, there's also anti-racism. The campaign against slavery was premised on the fundamental Christian and Enlightenment principle that all human beings are equal, regardless of race and cultural development. Next point, it is not true that to talk about one culture being superior to another is racist. It is not true, so long as you're careful in qualifying what you say. It is usually, I think, unwise to dismiss any culture wholesale. Though maybe I struggle to find what was admirable in Nazi culture. And I observe that progressive people tend to regard anything to their right as Nazi. So progressive people think that progressive culture is superior. But I think one needs to be more discriminate and to say that a culture that recognizes that the earth goes around the sun rather than the sun going around the earth is superior in that scientific respect. Or a culture that has developed ships that can cross oceans is superior in terms of maritime technology in that respect. Or a culture that has learned that human sacrifice and enslavement and infanticide are immoral is superior morally, I think, and probably most progressive people would think too, to one that practices those things. So wholesale disparagement of another culture may well be racist, but one can be discriminate. And to regard one's own culture as superior to another in a certain respect does not mean one regards one's own culture as perfect. So assertions of cultural superiority, if they're qualified, are not racist, necessarily. Finally, just on the British Empire, what do I think about that? If you want the full story, you need to buy the book. But in brief, in my conclusion, I end up saying the history of the British Empire contains this list of bad stuff, page 276, and this list of good stuff, page 277. Which weighs more heavily? You can't really say. You can't compare apples and oranges. You can say, contrary to the anti-colonialists, no, there was nothing in the British Empire that was Nazi. No, genocide wasn't committed in Tasmania. And then finally, I argued there was a progression in virtue, and the progression of virtue expressed itself during the Second World War when the Empire, you know this well, joined together to fight Nazi Germany. And if you're in northeast Sicily, southwest of Mount Etna, driving from Regal Buta to Agira, as I once was a few years ago, you will find a military cemetery on your left. Get out of your car, walk up the gentle slopes, you find yourself surrounded by young Canadians. And if you walk among the headstones long enough, you will discover one devoted to a certain H.R. Anderson, aged 28, killed on the 18th of July 1943, and his headstone bears the stark epitaph, anti-fascist fighter. Anderson was a volunteer. He answered the call, just as those young New Zealanders who lie in the cemetery at Suda Bay in Crete answered the call to fight fascism. Who called them? The British Empire. And if you have to go down as an empire, exhausting yourself fighting fascism, I can't think of a better way to go. Okay, so that's what is so offensive about my book. Okay, so I'm going to speak now about issues of free speech, and I'm going to talk first of all about the nature of the problem as I see it. Then I'm going to move more positively to the nature of the solution, and I'll end with good news. So here are the elements of the problem. First of all, and I talk about universities, it's my field, but what I say about universities will apply more or less elsewhere. So certainly, and I discovered this in 2017, there are illiberal political activists among professors. I didn't know people like Priyambada Gopal existed, now I do. And they've been influenced by various academic theories of post-colonialism or Michel Foucault, etc. So that's one problem. There are ideological zealots out there. They're not a majority, but they are very noisy. Secondly, the zealots only exist because other people have appointed them. Other people have promoted them. And by the way, since Priyambada Gopal's outburst against me, she was promoted to professor by Cambridge University. And in 2018, I decided to write to the heads of Priya's faculty of English and college, Churchill College. And I said, look, I'm a big boy. If Priya wants to spit venom at me, I can stand it. But here's the thing. Her students are watching her behavior. Her students are seeing how she behaves toward me. Seeing how she behaves toward me, how on God's earth would they dare disagree with her? Okay? Now, I'm going to raise a slightly complex matter. We might not all agree with it, but I'm raising it because it needs thinking about. The response of the head of her faculty and the head of her college was, in effect, well, what she wrote was lawful, which is true. So she had a right to free speech, which is true. But I think, in fact, the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Auckland University, with whom Jonathan and I were speaking the other day, kind of conceded this, that there should be a kind of professional code that governs how members behave, how teachers behave towards students, which is probably more restrictive than the law. So even if it's legal for Priyambada Gopal to shout abuse at me, she probably shouldn't do it because of the examples she shows her students, because her behavior would intimidate them and chill their capacity to speak freely to her. So I notice I'm actually arguing for a safe space for students, but here's the difference. Not a safe space for students to be shielded from points of view, but a safe space for students to speak their minds. And not a safe space for Priyambada Gopal to be shielded from their contradiction. But it's a bit complicated, but yeah. My main point here is I want to say, yes, there's a problem with illiberal academics. There's also a problem with those who appoint them and their failure to defend liberal conduct. Then third, there's a problem with the mild majority who are not sure what they think, but are sure they want to keep out of trouble. I first became aware of this in 2016 when I took part in a debate in the Oxford Union on whether the statue of Cecil Rhodes should fall from the back of Oriel College. Cecil Rhodes died in 1902, famous, infamous capitalist, imperialist buccaneer in South Africa, not a poster boy for the British Empire, and yet nor was he South Africa's Hitler, as his critics say. So there's a statue in the back of Oriel College because he gave money to the college. And if you really want to be offended by it, you have to crane your neck to see it. But there it is, and so a bunch of students decide they want it taken down because he's colonialist. So there we are in the chamber of the Oxford Union in Oxford, and I'm, of course, arguing against the motion that he should fall. And time and again, when proponents of the motion that Rhodes should fall spoke, after they finished, the chamber erupted in applause and cheering and clapping and whistling. And if you listened, you would have concluded that 95% of people in this chamber are in favor of Rhodes falling. But then I got tired of listening and I watched. When I watched, I noticed more than half the people in the chamber were doing nothing. They were watching. But, and this is the point, the aggressive noise of a minority intimidating a majority into silence makes it appear as if the minority are a majority, and they're not. But a third part of the problem is the intimidation of a majority. And the fourth part of the problem is that one reason the mild majorities stay silent in the face of what many of them doubt or disagree with is they've noticed how their own institutions fail to support dissidents. So there's an institutional problem. So, for example, in Britain, the lesbian, gender-critical feminist Kathleen Stock, who you can watch her on YouTube, she is the very model of reasonableness. I admire her enormously. She was subjected to a campaign of vilification by students who, of course, when they were protesting against her, wore masks so they couldn't be identified, aided and abetted by some of her own colleagues, unsupported by her union, and unsupported by her university, was so demoralized that she gave up her 18-year-old career and resigned and ended her full-time academic career. Okay? And for every one Kathleen Stock, there are thousands of people watching and saying, my God, I will never put myself in her position. I will keep my mouth shut. One incident creates a wave of intimidation and self-censorship. And that raises the question as to why did her university not support her? I'm not sure. Lots of institutions behave this way. But I just observe that universities are now businesses. Nothing against business. Nothing against business. And universities have to make ends meet, of course they do. But they need to remember what they're a business for. And among other things, I think universities should be a business for the formation of graduate citizens who know how to handle controversy over difficult issues and can handle it with reason, not with shouting and screaming and stamping and intimidation. But I think in the case of some universities, the commercial priority, the business priority takes precedence, so they forget what they're for. And therefore they become highly sensitive to how their customers see them. They misunderstand. They look at social media and they think that most students must think what goes on Twitter, which is not true, in fact. But they think, therefore, that if they pander to progressive students, that somehow that'll cost them least. I'm speculating here, it's not unreasonable, but there's the issue of why it is institutions fail to support their staff when they come under, in Kathleen's case, a campaign of ugly vilification. A fifth problem is that universities certainly have fallen into the custom of taking legal advice from advocacy bodies. So there's a body in Britain called Stonewall, maybe you have it here, which is pro-LGBTQ. That's fine. But it's been discovered that Essex University, for example, was taking its cue from what Stonewall would like the law to be, but in fact, Essex was behaving in contradiction of the law. So there's a problem with universities misunderstanding what the law is because they outsource it to bodies that have an interest. And the sixth problem, in case you've forgotten what the previous 5 were, I'll summarize in a moment, is a confusion of concepts. So you may have come across this notion of hate speech. Okay. In English law, I'm told, hate speech has no standing at all. It doesn't mean anything. We have in Britain, we have a law against the incitement to racial hatred. There's no law against hate speech. But what has happened is that for political reasons, certain progressive groups have decided to stick on any dissent or any criticism hatred. So if you're a transgender person and you want me to use your pronouns, I say, no, I'm not going to do that because what you're doing baffles me, doesn't make sense. And you're welcome to use your pronouns, but don't make me do that. I will be labeled a transphobe. I hate trans people. No, I don't. I just don't get it. I don't hate you, just don't get it. It's common sense, isn't it? Dissent and criticism are one thing, hatred another. Hate speech confuses them. I'm the only person in my own hearing who's ever made that distinction in the last year or so. Can we please now make it more often? Because it's obvious. But somehow our institutions and those who lead us buy into this notion that to dissent or to criticize people who belong to what we regard as previously vulnerable groups, that amounts to hatred. It's just nonsense. Okay, so summarize, what threatens freedom of speech? Certainly a minority of illiberal activists. Second, indulgent, not liberal enough academics who appoint and promote them. Third, risk-averse, intimidated majority. Fourth, unsupportive institutions led by people whose overriding concern is market reputation. Fifth, the outsourcing of legal advice to activist bodies. And sixth, the deliberate confusion of common sense concepts such as hate and dissent. Okay. That's the problem as I see it, speaking from universities. So what's the solution? Only 4 bits to this and much shorter. First of all, more members of the intimidated, tongue-tied majority need to find their dissident voices. Now, I do understand. I was able to do what I did because I was very senior in a university that remains pretty liberal, with control of a research centre whose funding I had complete command of. So I was relatively invulnerable. But other people, junior academics who've asked to meet with me because they sympathise with my views, insist that we meet when no one can see us, because they're worried about what their colleagues will do to them and their careers if they're seen. It's horrible. And when junior colleagues say to me, I wish, I think as you do, I wished I could say it, I feel bad. They say, no, bide your time, get tenure, get a protected position where they can't kick you out, then speak your mind. So you need to play the long game here. So I get it that not everyone is Scottish, not everyone speaks their mind the way I do. But those who, for whatever reason, feel they could take the risk, please take it. Because otherwise, if no one in the room speaks up, everyone in the room thinks they're the only one harboring the dissent. If you speak up, you will find other people will come up to you and say, thank you. Now they may not do it in public, but more will in time. So the first thing is, if the spirit moves you to say what you think, take the risk. Secondly, you need generous supporters to come up behind you and say, okay, how can we help? So, for example, in 2019, I held a conference in Oxford under the title Academic Freedom Under Threat, What is to be Done, at the end of which a representative of the Legatum Institute in London, funded by 2 New Zealanders, thank you, New Zealand, came up to me and said, if you want to hold a subsequent meeting to plot, Legatum is at your service. I took him up in it, and in October 20 of us met and began to conspire. One of us was Toby Young, who in January the next year founded the Free Speech Union. We then met in 2020 twice with the Minister for Universities and presented ideas for what government could do. Government can't do everything. Government shouldn't be asked to do everything. Could do something. Our advice turned into the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill in 2021, which was enacted last year. But here's the thing. Individuals gather together, supported by generous donors. Without Legatum's support, we wouldn't have had a place to meet. Without paying money, we wouldn't have had free dinners and whatever. Don't mock dinners. Don't mock good wine. In terms of building friendship and camaraderie and batting ideas back and forth, if there are any generous donors there, don't mock good dinners. It's not. It may look like fun. It is fun, but it's also important in community building. But without that, I'm not sure we would have got off the ground. So individuals, concerned donors who want to help, institutions, Free Speech Union, which now we have a national institution in Britain. Now you have a national institution, the Free Speech Union in New Zealand. Beleaguered individuals are no longer alone. Yeah. And then the combination of a free speech union and the press, or the media, it's a bit more difficult in New Zealand, I think. In Britain, we have a centre and right-wing press, the Times, Telegraph, Daily Mail, thinking of the print press, each of whom is concerned about free speech. So Toby Young at the FSU in the UK, a case comes to him, he leaks the information to the press, and the university institution finds its name on the pages of the press, and what it's doing is broadcast to the population, and it is embarrassed in public. Very powerful for institutions that only care about reputation. So individuals, generous donors who care, institutions, and leveraging the press, I think, are a very good recipe for improvement. So I've told you about the last 4 years in Britain, and I want to end on a note of hope here. When I fell into trouble in 2017, there was nothing to support me. I wasn't entirely unsupported, and I survived. Now there's the FSU. Now we think the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, if the current government were to allow it to operate, would have an important effect. What it would do, it does several things, but one thing it does is to create an external complaints system. So to allow beleaguered students and professors, having exhausted internal processes, to appeal to somebody outside of their university without incurring the expense of going to court, which no one can afford. If the Act comes into operation, members of the university can appeal to the regulator of the Office of Students and to a new officer in the Office of Students called the Director of Freedom of Speech. And the regulator will then adjudicate the case, and should they find the university delinquent in holding free speech according to the law, the university can be fined. Now, I suspect, there are other provisions too, but I suspect after one or two complaints where a university gets fined, the bad behavior of universities won't persist. So in a sense, initially I think the complaints system might be used. I think the need to use it will become increasingly small. Unfortunately, as I hinted, the Labour government, which came in July without any warning, announced shortly afterwards that it was going to pause, perhaps repeal the Act. A reliable source within government tells us that what happened was that Vice-Chancellors had lent on the then Shadow Secretary of State for Education to pull the Act because Vice-Chancellors did not want to make public, as the Act would have required them to make public, their reliance on Chinese funding. Okay. So that's bad news. On the other hand, we now have a free speech union that is well funded, and thanks to the government's decision to pause the bill, the free speech union subscribing membership increased by about 25%. And the free speech union is sufficiently well resourced by subscriptions and generous donations to be able to take the government to court, and has applied for judicial review on the grounds the Act was passed by all parties in Parliament. 7 years ago, when I was first dragged into the culture war over colonial history, there was no Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, there was no Free Speech Union in the UK, nor were there other bodies such as the Committee for Academic Freedom, Alumni for Freedom of Speech, and History Reclaimed. In other words, all of these things, these bodies grew up from the grassroots upwards. Government didn't do anything except pass the Act, and even the inspiration from that didn't come from government, it came from below. So in other words, in just over 4 years, the defenders of free speech have gathered together and supported by concerned and generous donors. They've organized, they've built networks involving civil servants and the press, with the effect that when institutions and governments fail to uphold free speech, they are now publicly challenged and embarrassed. And that's really, really, really good news, because what is at stake is so important. It's not just the freedom of individuals to mouth off, to voice their own dissent, not just the freedom of individuals to publish unfashionable research. It is that. But what's at stake is much bigger. It's the future of liberal society, whose members are free to challenge reigning orthodoxies, to challenge prevalent ideas, and to expose their falsehoods. Falsehoods which, if allowed to misshape public policy, domestic and foreign, will damage children, endanger women, hinder race relations, and undermine the self-confidence of the liberal West. And we just can't afford to let that happen, so let's not. Thank you very much.